Okay, so today we're going to be looking at two different areas in our study guide. The first one we're going to be looking at is innovation and experimentation in a new art form. We haven't seen this yet. So we're going to be looking at conceptual and video art. And then later on, we'll look at Black art. Okay. So in postmodernism, this is the time period that we're in. There's a lot of merging of different styles. And so we have a lot of pluralism or neo styles. So neo means new. So when we had neoclassical, right, it was this new classical style. So we're going to see a lot of these as well. So one of them is what we often call neo conceptualism. And so that's what we're going to kind of focus on today. And so this is a really bad joke, kind of intentionally bad joke. So what do you get when you cross a postmodernist with a used car salesman? You get an offer you can't understand. So sometimes some of these works in postmodernist period are kind of hard to understand. I know that sometimes I go to a museum and I might be really interested in a piece because it has a real visceral quality to it, texture, color, but sometimes this subject matter in the painting is a little obtuse. It's like something I don't quite understand. And so we're going to try to break down things as best as we can and understand the context. That's the nice thing about this class is that you've got like now a greater understanding of art history, and you can start to notice when people are playing off something that happened before, and kind of gain knowledge based on what you've learned about artists over the span of thousands upon thousands of years. So we're going to first look at conceptual art. So conceptual art, we've seen it before, right? This is the dematerialization of the art object, where the art is really about the idea of art. It's about the concept of what is art. And often this art is very minimalist in nature. It often has a lack of touch, so you don't see a lot of mark making. You don't see a lot of elements of the artist. And of course, this comes from Duchamp, right? So the fountain, the urinal, okay? So this is a Joseph Kosuth. I'm going to close the door for a second. So I apologize. It was just, I was getting distracted by noises. So this is called the chair, right? This is the chair. So when you look at this artwork, you might be like, well, what's the big deal? However, if you look at it really carefully, you see that there is an actual chair. There's a photo of a chair, and there's a definition of a chair. So if you saw the word chair, you recognize it as a chair. But can you sit on the definition of a chair? You cannot, right? If someone asked you and showed you a photo of this picture on the left, you would say it's a chair. But can you sit on that chair? No, you can't, right? So the only part you actually could do is to sit on this physical chair. So they're often playing on the ideas of perception and how we view the world and, what is reality. Joseph Kosuth did lots of these very cerebral pieces and a lot of performance pieces. I kind of got rid of most of them, just kind of speed through. But another conceptual artist is Bruce Newman. And there's a couple of his pieces in Chicago. Some of them are at the MCA. And so does anyone know what's kind of innovative about the material that he's using, like his media? Does anyone know what this kind of media is called? Can anyone volunteer for this one? What's this called, this media?
Is it neon?
It is neon, very good. And so this is neon. And so not all of his works use neon, but often what they do is like this one on the right, the words kind of, they're not all on at the same time. Sometimes they kind of blink. And so there's like a kind of a pattern to the words, I should say. And so he's kind of looking at using neon, which we normally think of as signage. It's normally like on a storefront, right? Like a drugstore, a restaurant. It's normally used for signage. And what he's doing is trying to think about how it, using this new media in a new way. Now, the cool thing about Bruce Newman is he has a whole series where he's not to other pieces in art history. So why did he choose the spiral, right? He's referencing the spiral jetty. Do you guys remember a big major concept about why this is in a spiral form? Let's look at the words here. The true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths, right? As you're walking on this, it's supposed to have kind of a meditative sort of quality to it. So he's referencing a previous piece, right? He's looking at Smithson and he's thinking about how you can kind of meditate on the words and the spiral, just like a lot of ancients have done. Does anyone know which one of the 250s he's becoming? This is a photo of Newman. Anyone know what this one's based on? It's called the fountain, right? So here he actually is a fountain, right? Because he's spraying water from his mouth. This is actually other Duchamp. Duchamp, I didn't show these. He did a series based on these glass pieces. This is actually an old window frame, and it has kind of this dream sequence in it. And Newman made a colossal sculpture series based on the works of Duchamp. Okay, another artist working in conceptual art is Jenny Holzer. And what she does is she uses words, and she'll use a lot of media that we would normally think about for signage. So like in LCD monitor. This one is in Las Vegas. So when you read the words, protect me from what I want, it's very site specific, right? It makes sense based on the location, right? So she uses projection. She uses signage like old movie theaters. This is her installation at the Guggenheim. So the Guggenheim Museum in New York, based on the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, it has the monitor kind of goes up and spirals up, and so the words move. Lately, she's been using projection. So just like the people in the classroom who are watching the presentation through the projection, she will project words on top of buildings. And often they have something to do with the historical past of the building, making some sort of connection. So here's a medieval castle, and then it has kind of shriek, right? It has like these words that are kind of like scary and horrific based on the history of the place. This one is kind of her latest series that she has on her website. So in New York City, she was talking about violence. And so she projected them onto buildings in New York. So that leads us to one of the pieces in the 250. This is number 238. It's called the Electronic Superhighway by Namjoon Paik. So he is probably the father of this new kind of electric media. And some of his earlier pieces are all surrounded around a television, right? A television. And so this is one of his early pieces. It's kind of an old television. You guys probably have never even seen a television like this before. But why did he use a television? Now I want you to think about, okay, a time that you probably don't know, but a time before cell phones, right? A time before cell phones. When you use your cell phone, you use it to keep in touch with people, but you also use it for information, right? You understand the world through your social media, through the news that you get on your phone, right? Before the cell phone, right? People got their information from TV and from radio, right? So he intentionally used television because that's how people get their information. And what he used is a really powerful magnet. So on the very top of it, there's a powerful magnet on top of the television. What has the magnet done to the image on the TV?
It's warped the image, like it's distorted it.
Exactly. So he makes commentaries about how people, and this is an early piece, by the way. This is way before fake news, right? This thing that we have now, right? We have fake news. And so I'm being facetious. I don't believe in fake news, but I guess I do believe in fake news, different sides. But anyway, when he looks at this, he thinks about how our perception of reality is warped by whoever delivers that information, right? It can be transformed, it can be changed, right? So he does different installations. He will stack TVs on top of themselves. He will use live feeds from around the world. So whatever's happening where the camera is pointed will often be projected on the television set. Like I said, they call him the father of video art. He's one of the very first artists to kind of use video in his artwork. Sometimes they're kind of set up like a garden, right? Set up like a garden. And we can talk about that a little bit later. He is a Buddhist, and he believed in Zen Buddhism. And so often he will make connections with, like the gardens. Think about the Japanese gardens, the dry and the wet ones for peaceful meditation. Hence the reason he puts the TVs in this kind of garden scene. He also makes kind of people or computers that actually make direct references to like a Buddhist sculpture, right? So here we have kind of a typical Buddhist image, but then he's connected with all these wires and magnets and whatnot to a computer, and he's actually being recorded, right? Can you see how there's this old-timey recording device on the top of this old-timey computer that he's used as well? And so that leads us to the piece that we have, which is called the electronic superhighway. So what is it composed of? What is the media? So this would be a good thing to put in your form section, right? What you would want to put in your form section. So this is video art, right? This is video art. But if we look at it, it basically is 300 television sets that are stacked on top of one another. So they're stacked. I'm sure they're anchored together in some sort of way as well. And then on top of it, just like Newman, he used neon. So it has neon superimposed on top of it. And so there's the continental US is on one wall, and then on a separate wall, there is the inclusion of Alaska and Hawaii. I think that was an extra addition. I don't think it was original, but then he added it to it rather shortly after. I believe now it's actually in the National Gallery in Washington, DC, if I remember right. The first time this was installed, it was actually in New York City. Okay, so what is the superhighway that Paik was referring to, right? What was the superhighway? It's actually a few different things, right? One, it is the internet. Now, when he was making this, right, when he was starting to make pieces like this was actually before the internet was popular. This was before the internet was really used. He did not obviously didn't invent the internet. However, he actually used the term electronic superhighway before anyone else. So this artist used the term for the very first time that we later now use all the time to describe the internet. This electronic superhighway, right? Superhighway of information. Because he worked for the Rockefeller Foundation of Art, and he was trying to incorporate these new technologies into the art world. So he was using things like television, video, satellites, fiber optics, etc. So this was really, happening before it became commonplace. I think you guys know probably the internet started at some universities, kind of relaying information back and forth when they were doing like scientific experiments and so on. Right? So that's one area. The other superhighway component is the Dwight D. Eisenhower system of interstate and defensive highways. And so you guys are used to traveling along the highway system in the United States. As a kid, I didn't think anything of it. However, in studying history, I learned the history of it is a little bit scary. The highway system was created because of the Cold War, right? After World War II, the United States saw a need to create a system of transportation, because you have to think about how cumbersome it was in Europe to move troops, right? To move troops from one city to the next during World War II, right? As well as how to get people out of the major cities. All these cities were being bombed and people were having to hide in basements. They were trying to hide and get away as best they could, but they were kind of stuck. So under the administration of Eisenhower, we created this system of major roadways leading out of major cities. So, if we look especially at Chicago, right? We look at where we live, we can see how there's all these exits out of Chicago, right? So that you can leave safely. Another thing that these roads were designed for is that we can move equipment. So if we had to move the armies, we would have space to move tanks. They're even big enough and typically straight enough, but if you had to land an airplane on these roads, you could. So there's actually a direct correlation with the need of the military, as well as moving people out of harm's way. An additional part of it too is that it's a great way of moving commerce. So a lot of the reason we get our Amazon quickly is because they're shipped in trucks, right, along this interstate system, right? So when we look at superhighway, right, he's talking about that electronic connection of people, right? He's talking about the actual connections of people. And then when we look at the monitors, we'll notice that within a state, right? Let's look at a state here, right? We see the same information, right? There's the same visual information within each state. And then when we go to another state, it's something different, right? So within the states, what we have is imagery that is directly related to kind of what the state is known for, right? So if we look at Iowa, I see images of President Carter. You guys see President Carter? He was a president when I was really young, right? So they used Iowa. Why? Why would they put presidential candidates in Iowa? Eva, do you know?
Maybe because of the Iowa caucus.
Exactly. It's the kickoff location of our presidential system and our run for presidency. Very good. And so we've got that. If we look at Kansas here, this is a scene. It's not a very popular scene, but this is a scene from Wizard of Oz. And so there's Auntie M in the house, right? I wish they would have picked a picture with Dorothy so that you guys could really recognize it. But it's an image based on Kansas, right? So it alludes to something that the state is known for, right? So as a viewer, how are you supposed to participate with the work, right? If you're standing in front of this like this person, right? How do you participate with the work? Anyone have any educated guesses? I think this is the installation at the National Gallery, by the way. It's kind of different than the one in the photo, right? It's really dark. And so you can feel kind of the glow of the neon bouncing off of you. You kind of feel the connection between all these different states, all these different people are all connected and unified through that electronic system, right? Now, when this was in New York City, there was, when you looked at the state of New York, you actually would see an image of yourself because he had set up a camera so that the camera was pointing in New York City. And of course, you were in that setting. And so it was that location. So it either was the outside location of this place, or it was the image of inside the gallery, so that you were actually represented on the screen, right? And so we have people connected by the mass media, people are connected by television, we're connected by technology, things like the video, the phone, those optics. So it's a connection of in many different ways, right? We're kind of all unified by this neon. And so as you're staring at this very large installation, it's almost like you're meditating and looking at the connection that we all have. And so there's that influence of Zen Buddhism. Right? Any questions on the Superhighway? Okay. The next piece that we have is called The Crossing by Viola, and this too is video art. Viola is known for installations, and so they're not site specific, so they can pretty much go anywhere. Usually his work is shown in museums. I'm sure it's also shown in galleries as well. And so typically what they are is projections onto screens, projections onto walls. This piece on the right used to be in the MCA in Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Art. I don't know if it still is, but it had video projections on the top of oil drums. So actually you could see the images on these oil drums as well. Okay, so for the crossing, so the image that we have, the form of it is, it's a room-size video installation, right? Did I have the number on this one? Yeah, 239, right? So it's a room-size video installation that has two large screens, right? There are two large screens, and they're actually on opposite walls. So you actually can't see the two screens at the same time. You basically have to face one, and then you have to turn around and face the other one, okay? So both videos start at the very same time. They start at the very same time. What we have is a man. So a man walks into the video frame, and he walks really, really slowly. And eventually he stops, and he's very still. So he stops and he's very still. And so then on the two different screens, then the image kind of changes. Okay, on one side, there is fire, right? And the fire starts from the ground, and it starts very small, and then eventually it gets bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where you can't see the man at all anymore. Okay, on the opposite screen, we have a trickle of water. It's like a sprinkle that comes from above. So the fire comes from the ground, right? The water comes from above, and it's a sprinkle, and then it becomes a heavy rainstorm, and then it is like drenching, like it is just a downpour, buckets of water spraying down. Now on both screens, eventually it starts to trickle again. The fire goes out, the water starts to trickle. And what happens is the image of the man goes all away. And so we're actually going to watch a portion of this. We're not going to watch the whole thing. It's like a 10-minute long thing. So I'll let you have a link. So if you want to watch it on your own, you are welcome to. But what I'll do is kind of give you a kind of a preview of it. I think I should probably stop recording because it's probably copyrighted. So if you're watching this later at home, you can watch it with the links. So I forgot, I'm just putting this for the recording. I forgot to record. So going and looking at the slides for form. Right, so for Zen Buddhism, the meditative quality of it, you're standing for a long period of time in front of it, right? And then those allusions to Christianity and Hinduism as well. I apologize for repeating myself, but hopefully that was good for some of you to jot down some more notes. Okay. Questions on video art? Video art? Okay. Next, we're going to be looking at the idea, or we're going to invest identity in American art, focusing on Black art since 1980. Identity is a real common theme in the global contemporary, so we're going to actually look at it a couple of different times. So once again, a lot of the styles that we're talking about, all of the styles we're looking at are postmodern. And so one of the things that we see happening in Black art is appropriation. So taking possessions of imagery that maybe belong to someone else, or even the styles that we saw from someone else. So like that neo, right? Like when we look at Basquiat today, you can see he was referencing people like Picasso. Like he was looking at older styles and making allusions, making connections with other artists. But appropriation is often using imagery and then changing its meaning, right? Changing its meaning, giving it new meaning. So the first group we have are often called neo-expressionists, and they are the graffiti artists. Now, the first artist is not Black, but he kind of goes hand in hand with Basquiat, and it's Keith Haring. You've probably seen the work of Keith Haring before. He started being very popular because he would go into the New York subway system, and there used to be these information boards where people could like post, oh, I need a roommate, right? It'd be like a bulletin board, or there would be flyers up on the wall, but they also had chalkboards. And so on the chalkboards, they would write if there was a delay of the train or something like that. And so what he did is he would carry sticks of chalk with him, and he'd start doing these doodles and drawings on the wall. And so they became kind of popular. People were always kind of looking at them. So they're kind of a good example of graffiti art, but also like street art, art meant for the masses that you see as you kind of walk down the street. And so his works are typically very colorful, very bright, very optimistic, but he does make a lot of pointed commentaries based on life. He becomes an artist who starts to work for a group called ACT UP. And ACT UP was an activism group trying to defeat AIDS. Keith Haring was a gay man, and I want to say he died of AIDS, but I can't actually remember. Now I feel like maybe I'm incorrect, so I don't want to necessarily say it definitively. But he was active in it, and so he did a lot of advertising for that group. But a lot of his pieces seem very optimistic, but kind of like when we saw Paik's work of Superhighway, he often was making connections with how people are kind of controlled by technology. And so if you look here, we have this really simplified computer, right? And it's like this on top of a mountain. Notice how it looks like it's on top of a pyramid. And then what are these people doing at the very base? They've got their arms straight up, right? It's kind of like they're praising the glory of the computer. And in the arms of the computer, we have maybe a spaceship or a hat, but then we also have a brain, right? So we're kind of controlled by our technology. He does a lot of barking dogs, these kind of stick figures, right? And that leads us to the Horn Players by Jean-Michel Basquiat, right? 226. So Basquiat started as well as a street artist. He worked with a high school friend named Diaz. And what they would do is they would basically put up quotes. They would tag buildings and images, or they would paint their images on all these different neighborhoods in the city. So he did it where, I think he lived in Brooklyn. He would do it in Brooklyn. He would do it in the subway system like Herring did. He also did it in the gallery district. So there's these gallery districts in like Soho, things like that in the city. And so he starts to write funny quotes, kind of making pointed commentaries. He would paint images and kind of his stereotypical kind of the insignia. And you maybe have seen this before. I've seen them on t-shirts, is this Samo, right? So the Samo with the crown, it's kind of like his signature. And it stands for same old shit, right? And so he was doing that for about 2 years on these different things. And he kept this was often incorporated into his paintings as well. But he really got noticed by the gallery system. They noticed how funny he was. They liked his kind of rawness to his street art. And so because a lot of his works were in that gallery district, they kind of ate him up. He was, I think, first generation American. I think his family was from like Puerto Rico and Haiti. So he was an immigrant in the city. And so his family was, and so he came from this, meager upbringing where he didn't really have a lot of arts education. And so his style was often kind of outside. Sometimes people would call him more of a primitive artist just because he's kind of untrained, but that doesn't mean he wasn't trained by himself. So he kind of grew up fast in the art world. He knew all the heavy hitters of the 80s. So this is him with Keith Haring that we just saw. Here he is with Andy Warhol, right? He was very popular and kind of beloved. Sadly, his fast lifestyle is the thing that led to his end. He had a drug overdose rather young. I think he was in his early 30s, if I remember right. And so here's a great example of his style, right? A great example of his style. And so when you look at his work, right, what are some words that we can use to kind of describe it? What are some words we can use to describe it? Cora, can you give me one?
It's almost like frightening in a way.
It is kind of frightening. They got these big giant eyes and then like these big teeth, right? And some of them are gold and some of them are white. Anything else? Any other words we'd use to describe? Katie, can you help out?
I guess like a lot of features are like exaggerated.
Right, it's kind of like exaggerated, it's kind of distorted. So his technique, and actually, let me do something really fast here. I'm gonna undo this one because it kind of leads to what we're talking about, is that he was often coined the Black Picasso. And the reason for that isn't not that they saw similarities in his style, but he actually educated himself on art history because he didn't have necessarily the art training that most artists in the gallery system had. He was read art history books and looked for references. And so he tried to train himself in art history and the practices of current artists. So there's a sense of abstraction to his pieces. He looked at abstract expressionists. This is a Basquiat on the left. And so he thought, like, when he looked at the work of de Kooning, he would think about how he could show that kind of visceral brushstroke. How do you apply the paint in a very emotional way? Remember that these are often called neo-expressionist, right? So there's this sense of mood and emotion that's supposed to be exuded by the works. This is some early expressionism of Europe, and this is Dubuffet. And this is actually one of the reasons why I unskipped this one, is this strange sort of cow. Look at his large hypnotic eyes, right? And then in Basquiat's work, we see how big the eyes are. It's like we have to make connections. We have to look at those eyes. But his style is kind of crude, right? His style is kind of crude. It's intentionally not perfected. It's kind of rough. It's very abstracted. His work is really tied to his graffiti roots. So a lot of his pieces, plus the one that we're going to see in the 250, often have a lot of text incorporated. So there's a lot of words, right? Just like he was tagging on the sides of the street. But another thing you'll notice is the sense of rawness in how he presents his works. Notice this one, how you see part of the frame coming out. I'm going to go back to the first one we saw. Here you can see the frame on the outer part, and then notice how he stitches the frame and the canvas onto it. So you actually see the structure of the painting as well. That's pretty stereotypical for his work. So eventually he starts to incorporate Black history in his pieces. And so when you look at this one, right, you can see it says colonization part 2 in a series volume, right? So here he's talking about the slave trade, right? He's talking about slave trade and, you know, people in as goods and services. You also see that incorporation of, like I said, that crown, which is like his insignia, his signature. So several of his later pieces are kind of like in triptychs in a way. They're like divided into 3, like an altar piece. And that leads us to the horn players, Okay, so 226 in our study guide. Right? So what's the subject matter of the horn players, right? Let's look at this for a second. What visual elements are used to represent the subject matter? Does anyone know who this painting is about by looking at it? You guys see any words that you recognize? Any volunteers? Right? This is a portrait of Dizzy Gillespie and what's his name? His last name's Parker. What's his first name? Does anyone remember? Darn it, I can't remember his first name. But anyway, this is basically an image about 2 really well-known jazz musicians. So we actually can see them incorporated into it on the right and the left, right? So we have a saxophone for Parker, right? We have a trumpet for Gillespie. We have music notes. We have scat. So scat is kind of like making words and noises that come out of your mouth. It makes them sound like they are musical instruments. So you kind of see a lot of repeated phrases like scat. And then those repeated words that he uses are things like dizzy, ornithology, pre, and teeth. And those are all allusions to these two artists. There's a very famous album called Ornithology, which is about birds, right? And then pre is the name of a daughter, right? So these are all related to these musicians, to these jazz musicians, right? So when he was looking at this, he was actually looking at a very famous Picasso, right? So this is the Picasso's Three Musicians. What's similar about these two works? Isabel, can you help me? What's similar about these two works?
It's kind of like disjointed, and there's like the music notes kind of floating.
Right? So we got disjointed, we've got separation of three, right? We've got the musical instruments incorporated, and it's very abstract, right? They're not highly detailed, but you understand that these are representation of musicians, that these are representation of musical instruments, of music, and so on with those music notes. Okay, questions on Basquiat? There's more information on Smart History if you feel like you need to add to it. Okay, the next piece that we have is called Dancing at the Louvre, and this is from a series called the French Collection. This is by the artist Faith Ringgold. So this is number 232 in your note takers. So does anyone know what this media is? Kwana, do you know what this media is?
Is it a quilt?
It is a quilt. So Faith Ringgold is a painter. She works in paint as well. But one of the things that she starts to do is use old methods of art. She is a well-known, she's still around. She's a very well-known Black woman artist. And she would have been really good in our discussion last week when we were talking about feminism. She's a big advocate of women being incorporated into the art world. There's a great series, great show called Black Art in the Absence of Light on HBO Max, if you have that streaming service at home. And she talks about her activism in it, which was really interesting. And so in a lot of her pieces, she addresses what is normally thought of as women's work, right? And craft, or excuse me, quilting is kind of a craft that is normally done by women. Women normally get together. They often have these quilting bees. So normally a quilt is often made by a group of women sitting around sewing together and chit-chatting as they do it. So it's normally seen as traditional women's work, right? This is her first quilt, and she actually not only quilted it, but she also added painting to it. So often her quilts have acrylic paint or oil paint or even watercolor incorporated into it. The one that we have in the 250 is acrylic. So she uses traditional medias of like refined women. Because if you remember in like Victorian times, women were actually often encouraged to paint, right? They were encouraged to learn how to watercolor, how to oil paint, kind of as ways to bide their time. Normally these women did this before they had children. So it was something that young, refined, wealthy women typically did, right? And then also thinking about women being in the storytellers. So women were often the storytellers in different groups, and so kind of passing along history that way. Right? So the old methods, right, are kind of listed there. And I mentioned most of those new methods as well. I forgot that this was strangely animated, so I apologize. So what she was trying to do is to elevate this craft into high art, So to create as a fine art. And then she would use the acrylic paint for detail, and she would add her writing to it, often in the borders. This one, it's actually incorporated into it. And you see that into the different squares. Sorry, I lost my pencil. Right? So quilts. Quilts have been around forever, right? People have been quilting with old pieces of fabric from clothing for a long, long time. But there is a deep-rooted history of it in the Black South, especially for enslaved people. So quilts were used to keep warm, but also during the Underground Railroad, they would create symbols that were directions to help people move to the north to get into safety. So she was also alluding that part of the historical past of Blacks in America. So this is not her piece on the side. This was a piece that had those symbols that I was explaining. Another part of the context here too, I almost forgot, is that she, some of her earliest pieces were actually sewn by her mother, who was a seamstress. So she worked with her mother, and then her mother taught her some of the skills. Right? So this is her first piece, who is Aunt Jemima. You guys probably have heard about the controversy with Aunt Jemima lately, because it was less than a year ago that that brand kind of disappeared. But she made a piece. This is her first quilt based on who is Aunt Jemima. So this is kind of like this stereotype of this Mamie who takes care of white children, right, in the Deep South. And she's normally enslaved, but she seems happy about it. So she's playing on this stereotype. And so in the actual quilt, she makes references to other historical figures and has kind of like little bios of them as well. So she tells stories and makes pointed commentaries. This is another artist, Betty Sadar, who does this liberation of Aunt Jemima and makes stereotypes. So a Black artist making art, kind of poking fun of this happy enslaved person. You know, it is a mystique, it's not real, right? So maybe the thing that you're the most familiar with is a book that was really common in elementary school, especially by a lot of the art programs. So she wrote a book called Tar Beach, which is kind of an autobiography. It's not quite that. She kind of deviates from it a little bit, but basically it's a story about two little girls and kind of their dreams. And so here we have a family eating on the top of a building, and these two little girls are dreaming. Actually, they're flying in the sky. You can see them at the top here. So she uses traditional quilting and then paint and text to tell the story. So a lot of the illustrations in the book are based on her art. So that leads us back to our piece in the 250, which is 232, Dancing at the Louvre. And so does anyone know who Willa Marie Simone is? And does anyone know who that is? Right? She's a fictional artist that Faith Ringgold made up, right? She's a fictional artist. And so in the early 20th century, so 1920, like 19 teens, the 20s, the 30s, a lot of African-American artists, musicians, writers moved to Paris to get more kind of freedom. And so her word is kind of like a play on a lot of popular female artists of the day who would have moved their lives to Paris. And so there's a series of quilts that she made that are based on the famous people that she meets. And you can see smart history for that. And so as we look at it, and I go back to this illustration, the image tells us the story, but then also it's on either end of the quilt. So on the top and at the bottom, she has written in the story. So how the image is told is through imagery and text. Right? So what is the scene? Right? What is the scene? The name of it kind of tells us it's dancing at the Louvre. Which room is she in? Raheel? Do you know which room she's in? Who's the artist behind the group of people dancing?
Well, that's the Mona Lisa in the background.
It's Leonardo, right? We have Da Vinci here. We have the Mona Lisa. We have the Madonna of the Rocks, right? And so we have them dancing in front of Leonardo. Why would she put herself and the children dancing at the Louvre? Kind of a strange sort of concept, right? She did it to intentionally break the rules, right? Leonardo, right, is this historically white male artist, revered, right? And here she intentionally was trying to break the rules. You would not see a bunch of little African-American children dancing in the Louvre, right? She's trying to make a pointed commentary that it just wouldn't happen. And she wanted to intentionally kind of break the rules, not just of, you know, society, but also the art establishment. That these, you know, that she as a Black artist should be front and center, just like these other artists. She should be recognized for her achievements. So when we look at this, in the image, most of this stuff is all painted. So when we look at the Mona Lisa, it's on fabric, but all the detail here is painted on it as well. So make sure you incorporate that into the form component. We'll do an exercise with another kind of essay question, probably tomorrow on this image, because we'll run out of time today. We're going to do our last image by the artist Carol Walker, and this is called Darkytown Rebellion. This is 243. Okay, so excuse me. Walker was born in California in the 1960s. Her father was a professor at a university, and when she was rather young, so when she was a teenager, her family moved from California to right outside Atlanta, Georgia. And so he got a job working at a college. And she never really experienced blatant racism when she lived in California, right? She lived this life that was very scholarly, right? Because her father was was a professor, so he was in academia. And so she never really felt blatant racism. So then she moves to the Deep South and sees all of these monuments to the Confederacy. And she sees kind of what was happening. And she obviously felt racism. And so a lot of her work, it explores what it was like to live in antebellum, the South. And she gained fame really, really fast. So she became a very famous artist in her early 20s. And she's pretty much works exclusively out of New York City, I believe, today. I believe she's also a professor at one of the important schools in New York. I don't know which one she works out of. So she's an art professor, which most contemporary artists are. There's only a few that only work. A lot of them teach and work, right? So when you look at her work, where does she get inspiration? Does anyone know where she gets her inspiration? How does she tell her stories, and what stories is she telling? She's telling her stories on a few different things. The name of this one comes from a book. It's called Darkytown in American Primitive Painting. and there's this book, and in there's this painting, and it's kind of in black and white, and we don't know who the artist is, but she was researching and found this image. And when you look at it, you might see that the figures are almost in silhouette. They don't have a lot of detail to them, right? So they are like high contrast black and white, like the figures are, and then the backgrounds are kind of gray. And so it's really hard to see the detail, kind of like when we looked at Jacob Lawrence, right? Remember how people didn't really have faces? They could be representational of a bunch of different people, right? So she used this as influence. And then another thing she used is like a folk art. And so she actually used the style of the silhouette. And so the silhouette was something that was kind of like invented, I should say, or it was this crafty thing that would often become like a party or a court trick, where basically they would hire artists to make silhouettes of people. And you might have already done this before. Normally they're in profile, right? So they're like silhouettes, just the outer detail of a person, normally just like a bust, right? So chest up. And so how are the two styles different? How are the two styles different? Here's some examples of Kara Walker's, and here's that traditional silhouette. Isabella, can you help me?
Well, what the like silhouettes on the right are like more like quiet and refined, I guess, or whereas the ones on the left are like more active.
Right. So these are very stoic and calm on the right, right? You don't really notice expression or motion to their body. And the ones on the left by Walker are very expressive. We see their full bodies. We see, gestures. We see their form. We can almost even see the expressions on their faces, right? And so what she was doing is playing on stereotypes and caricatures of African Americans in the Deep South. And so how does she make her work? What she does is she draws the images with a white waxy pencil. I think it's a China marker that they often use in science class to write on beakers. But what she'll do is she'll draw on the paper, and then she cuts it out with a knife. And then she adheres it to the wall, kind of with like a wax. So it almost works like a restickable glue stick. And then she kind of like arranges them onto the wall. Now, sometimes she used projections to create the setting. So not all of hers have these backgrounds that you see here with the projection, right? Not all of them have that. We might come back and watch this video at the very end, because there's a great segment on Art 21, right? So here's kind of her process. You can see that the paper's kind of flimsy when she's installing it. It's got that waxiness on the back, which means she can peel them and rearrange them to help tell a story. And then she'll smooth them onto the wall. Normally she doesn't draw it directly, she does it through tracing paper so that she doesn't scratch or ruin the paper. And so why does she use the projection? What does the projection do? Erin, do you have any guesses on why she uses the projection?
It looks like it casts more color than the actual painting, which
Right.
is a silhouette.
Right. So she creates this very colorful landscape. And so when she's projecting it, she's using this old-timey sort of projection series. You might still have a few teachers in the building that use these projectors. They're not too common anymore. But what she does is she has these colored films that she'll put on the walls. And so they create this kind of colorful, chaotic, rebellious scene, right? Because this is a scene of rebellion. And it helps include the viewer in the image. So when you're standing here can you guys see here in the corner how there's a shadow of this woman who is here talking to this man, right? So you become a part of the history. You become a part of the story, right? Even if you were not a slaveholder, right? Right? There's white, and you're white, there's white privilege, right? If you're Black, right? You are a part of that history if your family comes from that ancestry, right? So she's trying to help you feel like you're a part of the story, you're a part of the history, right? You become part of the image. Through your shadow, through the color bouncing off of you, right? And so how is the imagery incorporated? This is actually two different installations. Can you see how she can move around the image however she kind of chooses? So here this woman is on the right, here the image is, the woman is in the center. And that's because it's this removable wax, right? But let's focus on the imagery itself, right? It's kind of disturbing. If you really pay close attention to it, it's really disturbing, right? So she uses exaggerated racial features. So a lot of, think about like early caricatures of Blacks, you see that they kind of have big eyes, or they'll have exaggerated mouths, or kind of exaggerated gestures. So she's playing off of those stereotypes. There's also just images that are kind of strange. So like we have this man, right, kind of bending over to these two little boys, and you're like, what is he doing? It seems like he's trying to entice them in some sort of way. Is he gonna hurt them? Is he offering them help? Is he offering them candy? Like, you're not quite sure. It's kind of ambiguous. And the fact that it's in Black silhouette, doesn't give you a lot of information. So it's unsettling. There's a man, right? Part of the rebellion, right? He's got his legs severed, and you actually see it on the ground. You see the bone exposed, kind of like the Kolashauki. Remember the snaky skirts, and you see her bones, right? You see a woman holding a plunger, and she's in like a typical like Southern Belle costume or clothing, and she's got this like over this pile. And when you look at the pile, you see that it's children, right? So like, did she like hit them with this plunger and make this pile of this bloody pool of children on the ground, right? And then we have this rebellion. So there's kind of like this group of people who are kind of marching through. They kind of see these as the rebellion figures. And one of them is holding a flag, and it cascades away. And so it looks like a ship sail. So that could be an allusion to like a slave ship. So she does her figures in silhouette to kind of help tell a story. One of her common motifs is to use a cyclorama. So this is basically a circular thing that you spin to kind of tell a story, but instead she makes these room-sized versions of them so that you're kind of surrounded by the story. So once again, you're kind of a part of the story. She doesn't always do Black silhouette. Sometimes she flips it. So this is an installation from the Art Institute of Chicago from a couple of years ago that I got to see. So she flips it, and it's white and Black stereotypes together. And then this is called Sugar Baby. And this was in the Domino Sugar Factory in New York City. And she makes this gigantic Mamie Sphinx out of, it wasn't all out of sugar. It actually was made out of like styrofoam, and then it was covered in sugar, right? And then she also has kind of this puppet show that she does with stories in silhouette as well, right? So tomorrow we'll practice a long essay. We'll start with that tomorrow. And like I said, if you really want to, you can always go back in and look at this Carol Walker video. I think it's really interesting. So I would highly suggest that for yourself. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and let you guys go today, and then I will see you guys again on Thursday. If you have any questions, let me know. Bye, everyone.